Hi. So I don't think anybody's on yet. I don't know if anyone will join us. They kind of said she would, but yeah. Um, I'm just going live, reading a book to you guys. So, the book that I have is Wicked Lovely. It's by Melissa Marr. This is one of my all-time favorite books. I've been reading it every single year. Around the beginning of winter time for the past several years, because it kind of has a wintry vibe to it, and I really enjoy the book. So, anyway, Wicked Lovely, Melissa Marr. All right. Starting out with the prologue. The Summer King knelt before her. It was the Summer King knelt before her. Is this what you freely choose, to risk the winter still? She watched him, the boy she'd fallen in love with these past weeks. She never dreamed he was something other than human, but now his skin glowed as if flames flickered just under the surface, so strange and beautiful she couldn't look away. It's what I want. You understand that if you are not the one, you'll carry the winter's chill until the next mortal risks this, and you'll warn her not to trust me. He paused, glancing with pain in his eyes. She nodded. If she refuses me, you will tell the next girl and the next. He moved closer. And not until one accepts will you be free of the cold. I do understand. She smiled as reassuringly as she could, and then she walked over to the hawthorn bush. The leaves brushed against her arms as she bent down and reached under it, her finger wrapped around the Winter Queen's staff. It was a plain, worn thing, as if countless hands had clenched the wood. It was those hands, those other girls who'd stood where she did now, that she didn't want to think about. She stood, hopeful and afraid. Behind her, he moved closer. The rustling of trees grew almost deafening. The brightness from his skin, his hair, intensified. Her shadow fell on the ground in front of her. He whispered, "Please let her be the one." She held the Winter Queen's staff and hoped. For a moment she even believed, but then ice pierced her, filled her like shards of glass in her veins. She screamed his name. "Keenan!" She stumbled toward him, but he walked away, no longer glowing, no longer looking at her. Then she was alone, with only a wolf for companionship, waiting to tell the next girl what folly it was to love him, to trust him. Chapter 1. 4-ball, side pocket. Aslan pushed the cue forward with a short, quick thrust. The ball dropped into the pocket with a satisfying clack. Her playing partner, Denny, motioned toward a harder shot, a bank shot. She rolled her eyes. "What, you in a hurry?" He pointed with the cue. "Right. Focus and control. That's what it's all about." She sank the two. He nodded once, as close as he got to praise. Aslan circled the table, paused, and chalked the cue. Around her, the cracks of balls colliding, low laughter, even the endless stream of country and blues from the jukebox kept her grounded in the real world, the human world, the safe world. It wasn't the only world, no matter how much Aslan wanted it to be. But it hid the other world, the ugly one, for brief moments. 3, corner pocket. She sighted down the cue. It was a good shot. Focus. Control. Then she felt it. Warm air on her skin. A fairy. Its too hot breath on her neck sniffed her hair. His pointed chin pressed against her skin. All the focus in the world didn't make Pointy Face's attention tolerable. She scratched. The only ball that dropped was the cue ball. Denny took the ball in his hand. "What was that?" "We gassed?" She forced a smile, looking at Denny, at the table, anywhere but at the horde coming in the door. Even when she looked away, she heard them, laughing, squealing, gnashing teeth, and beating wings. A cacophony she couldn't escape. They were out in droves now, freer somehow as evening fell, invading her space, ending any chance of the peace she'd sought. Denny didn't stare at her, didn't ask hard questions. He just motioned for her to step away from the table and called out, "Gracie, play something for Ash." At the jukebox, Grace keyed in one of the few not country or blues songs, Limp Bizkit's "Break Stuff." As the oddly comforting lyrics in that gravelly voice took off, building to the inevitable stomach-tightening rage, Aslan smiled. If I could let go like that, let the years of aggression spill out onto the Fae. She slid her hand over the smooth wood of the cue, watching Pointy Face gyrate beside Grace. I'd start with him. Right here. Right now. She bit her lip. Of course, everyone would think that she's utterly mad if she started swinging her cue at invisible bodies, but everyone but the Fae. Before the song was over, Denny had cleared the table. Nice! Aslan walked over to the ball rack and slid the cue back into an empty spot. Behind her, Pointy Face giggled, high and shrill, and tore out a couple strands of her hair. Rack 'em again? But Denny's tone said what he didn't. He knew the answer before he even asked. He didn't know why, but he could read the signs. Pointy Face slid the strands of her hair over his face. Aslan cleared her throat. Rain check? Sure. Danny began assembling his cue. The regulars never commented on her odd mood swings or unexplainable habits. She walked away from the table, murmuring goodbyes as she went, consciously not staring at the fairies. They moved balls out of line, bumped into people, anything to cause trouble. But they hadn't stepped in her bath tonight. Not yet. At the tables nearest the door, she paused. I'm out of here. One of the guys straightened up from a pretty combination shot. He rubbed his goatee, stroking the gray shot hair. Cinderella time? You know how it is. Gotta get home before the shoe falls off. She lifted her foot, clad in a battered tennis shoe. No sense tempting any princes. He snorted and turned back to the table. A doe-eyed fairy eased across the room, bone-thin with too many joints. She was vulgar and gorgeous all at once, her eyes far too large for her face, giving her a startled look. Combined with an emaciated body, those eyes made her seem vulnerable, innocent. She wasn't. None of them are. The woman at the table beside Aslan flicked a long ash into an already overflowing ashtray. See you next weekend. Aslan nodded, too tense to answer. In a blurringly quick move, doe eyes flicked the thin blue tongue out at a cloven-hoofed fairy. The fairy stepped back, but a trail of blood had already dripped down his hollowed cheeks. Doe eyes giggled. Aslan bit her lip hard and lifted a hand in a last wave to Denny. Focus. She fought to keep her steps even, calm, everything she wasn't feeling inside. She stepped outside, lips firmly shut against the dangerous words. She wanted to speak, to tell the Fae to leave, so she didn't have to. But she couldn't. Ever. If she did, they'd know her secret. They would know she could see them. The only way to survive was to keep the secret. Grams taught her that rule before she could even write her name. Keep your head down and your mouth closed. It felt wrong to have to hide, but if she even hinted at such a rebellious idea, Grams would have her in lockdown, homeschooled. No pool halls, no parties, no freedom, no Seth. She'd spent enough time in that situation during middle school. Never again. So, rage in check, Aslan headed downtown, toward the relative safety of iron bars and steel doors. Whether in its base form or in its altered into whether in its base form or altered into the purer form of steel, iron was poisonous to Faye and thus gloriously comforting to her. Despite the fairies that walked her streets, Huntsdale was home. She'd visited Pittsburgh, walked around D.C., explored Atlanta. They were nice enough, but they were too thriving, too alive, too filled with parks and trees. Huntsdale wasn't thriving. It hadn't been for years. That meant the Fae didn't thrive here either. Revelry rang from most of the alcoves and alleys she passed, but it wasn't ever as bad as the thronging choke of fairies that cavorted in the mall in D.C. or at the botanical gardens in Pittsburgh. She tried to comfort herself with that thought as she walked. There were less Fae here. Less people, too. Less is good. The streets weren't empty. People went about their business, shopping, walking, laughing. It was easier for them. They didn't see the blue fairy who had cornered several winged Fae behind a dirty window. They never saw the fairies. Oops, sorry. They never saw the fairies with lions' manes racing across power lines, tumbling over one another, landing on a towering woman with angled teeth. To be so blind. It was a wish Aslan had held in secret her whole life, but wishing didn't change what was. And even if she could somehow stop seeing the Fae, a person can't unknow the truth. Her tucked hands in her pockets and kept walking. Past the mother with her obviously exhausted children. Past the shop windows with the frost creeping over them. Past the frozen gray sludge all along the street. She shivered. The seemingly endless winter had already begun. She'd passed the corner of Harper and Third, almost there, when they stepped out of the alley, the same two fairies who'd been following her almost every day for the past 2 weeks. The girl had long white hair streaming out like spirals of smoke. Her lips were blue, not lipstick blue, but corpse blue. She wore a faded brown leather skirt stitched with thick cords. Beside her was a huge white wolf that she'd alternately lean or ride on. Whether When the other fairy touched her, steam rose from her skin. She bared her teeth at him, shoved him, and slapped him. He did nothing but smile. And when he did, he was devastating. He glowed faintly all the time, as if hot coals burned inside of him. His collar-length hair shimmered like strands of copper that would slice her skin if Aslan were to slide her fingers through it. Not that she would. Even if he were truly human, he wouldn't be her type. Tan and too beautiful to touch, walking with a swagger that said he knew exactly how attractive he was. He moved as if he were in charge of everyone and everything, seeming taller for it, but he wasn't really that tall. Not as tall as the bone girls by the river or the strange tree bark men that roamed the city. He was almost average in size, only a head taller than she was. Whenever he came near, she could smell wildflowers, could hear the rustle of willow branches, as if she were sitting by a pond on one of those rare summer days. A taste of midsummer and the start of the frigid fall. All she wanted was to keep in that taste, bask in it, roll in it underneath the until the warmth soaked into her very skin. It terrified her, the almost irresistible urge to get closer to him, to get closer to any of the Fae. He terrified her. Aslan walked a little faster, not running, but faster. Don't run. If she ran, they'd chase. Fairies always gave chase. She ducked inside the comics connection. She felt safer among the rows of unpainted wooden bins that lined the shop. My space. Every night, she'd slipped away from them, hiding until they passed, waiting until they were out of sight. Sometimes it took a few tries, but so far it had worked. She waited inside comics, hoping they hadn't seen. Then he walked in, wearing a glamour, hiding that glow, passing for human, visible to everyone. That's new. And new wasn't good. Not where the Fae were concerned. Fairies walked past her, past everyone, daily, invisible and impossible to hear unless they willed it. The really strong ones, those that could venture further into the city, could weave a glamour, fairy manipulation, to hide in plain sight as humans. They frightened her more than the others. This fairy was even worse. He had donned a glamour between one step and the next, becoming suddenly visible, as if revealing himself didn't matter at all. He stopped at the counter and talked to Eddie, leaning close to be heard over the music that blared from the speakers in the corners. Eddie glanced her way, then back at the fairy. He said her name. She saw it, even though she couldn't hear it. No. The fairy started walking toward her, smiling, looking all the world like one of her wealthier classmates. When she turned away and picked up an old issue of Nightmares and Fairy Tales, she clutched it, hoping her hands weren't shaking. Aslan, right? Fairy Boy was beside her, his arm against hers, far too close. He glanced down at the comic, smiling wryly. Is that any good? She stepped back slowly and looked him over, as if he was trying to pass for a human she'd want to talk to. Sorry. If he was trying to pass for a human she'd want to talk to, he'd failed. From the hems of his faded jeans to his heavy wool coat, he was too uptown. He dulled his copper hair to a sandy blonde, hidden that strange rustle of summer, but even in his human glamour, he was too pretty to be real. Not interested, she slid the comic back into place and walked down the next aisle, trying to keep the fear at bay, and failing. He followed, steady and too close. She didn't think he'd hurt her, not here, not in public. For all their flaws, the Fae seemed to be better behaved when they wore human faces. Maybe it was the fear of the steel bars in human jails. It didn't really matter why. What mattered was that it was rule they seemed to follow. But when Aslan glanced at him, she still wanted to run. He was like one of the big cats in the zoo, stalking its prey from across a ravine. A dead girl waited at the front of the shop, invisible, seated on her wolf's back. She had a pensive look on her face, eyes shimmering like an oil slick, strange glints of color on a black puddle. Don't stare at invisible fairies, rule number 3. Aslan glanced back down at a bin in front of her calmly, as if she'd been doing nothing more than gazing around at the store. I'm meeting some people for coffee. Fairy Boy moved closer. You want to come? No, she stepped sideways, putting more distance between them. She swallowed, but it didn't help how dry her mouth was, how terrified and tempted she'd felt. He followed. Some other night. It wasn't a question, not really. Aslan shook her head. Actually, no. She already immune to your charms, Keenan? Dead Girl called out. Her voice was lilting, but there was a harsh edge under her words. Smart girl. Aslan didn't reply. Dead Girl was invisible. Don't answer invisible fairies. Rule number 2. He didn't answer her either. Didn't even glance her way. Can I text you? Email? Something? No. Her voice was rough. Her mouth was dry. She swallowed. Her tongue stuck to the roof of her mouth, making a soft clicking noise when she tried to speak. I'm not interested at all. But she was. She hated herself for it, but the closer he stood to her, the more she wanted to say yes, yes, please yes, to whatever he wanted, but she wouldn't, couldn't. He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and scrawled something on it. Here's mine, when you change your mind. I won't, she took it, trying not to let her fingers too near his skin, afraid that contact would somehow make it worse, and shoved it in her pocket. Passive resistance. That was what Grams could counsel. Just get through with it and get away. Eddie was watching her. Dead Girl was watching her. Fairy Boy leaned closer and whispered, I'd really like to get to know you. He sniffed her like he was really some sort of animal, no different than the less human-looking ones. Really. And that would be rule number 1. Don't ever attract Fairy's attention. Aslan almost tripped trying to get away. From him and from her own inexplicable urge to give in. She did stumble in the doorway when Dead Girl whispered, Run while you can. Keenan watched Aslan leave. She didn't really run, but she wanted to. He could feel it, her fear, like the thrumming of a startled animal. He could feel it, her fear, like the thrumming heart of a startled animal. Mortals didn't usually run from him, especially girls. Only one ever had done so in all the years he played this game. This one, though, she was afraid. Her already pale skin blanched when he reached out to her, making her look like a wraith framed by her straight blue-black hair. Delicate. It made her seem more vulnerable, easy to approach. Or maybe that was just because she was so slight. Hello? Oh, yeah, I'll do that. I'm not going to end the stream, but I'll be back in like 5 minutes. Move the music closer. Hello, I'm back. Hope that wasn't too long. Hello. What's up? I had to move my car. Well, I hope you're enjoying the book so far. I'm going to take a drink of water. But 20 minutes, that's not too bad. Man, I ran. I'm out of breath. Alright, back to it. Alright, I'll start back from Keenan's perspective. Keenan watched Aslan leave. She didn't really run, but she wanted to. He could feel it, her fear, like the thrumming of a heart of a startled animal. Mortals didn't usually run from him, especially girls. Only one had ever done so in all the years he'd played this game. This one, though, she was afraid. Her already pale skin blanched when he reached out to her, making her look like a wraith framed by her straight blue-black hair, delicate. It made her seem more vulnerable, easier to approach. Or maybe that was just because she was so slight. He imagined he could tuck her head under his chin and fit her whole body in the spare fold of his coat. Perfect. She'd need some guidance on attire, replace the common clothes she seemed to prefer, add on a few bits of jewelry, but that was inevitable these days. At least she had long hair. She'd be a refreshing challenge, too, in strange control of her emotions. Most of the girls he'd picked were so fiery, so volatile. Once he'd thought that was a good indicator. Summer queen, fiery passion, it made sense. Danya interrupted his thoughts. I don't think she likes you. So? Danya pursed her blue lips, the only spot of color in her cold, white face. If he studied her, he could find proof of the changes in her. The blonde hair had faded to white of a snow squall. The pallor that made her lips seem so blue. But she was still as beautiful as she had been when she'd taken over as the Winter Girl. Beautiful, but not mine. Not like Aslan will be. Keenan, Danya snapped, a cloud of frigid air slipping out with her voice. She doesn't like you. She will. He stepped outside and shook off the glamour. Then he said the words that sealed so many mortal girls' fates. I've dreamed about her. She's the one. And with that, Aslan's mortality began to fade. Unless she became the Winter Girl, she was his now, for better or for worse. Alright. Chapter 2. As freaked as she was by the fairy approaching her, Aslan couldn't go home. If everything seemed calm, Grams didn't put many restrictions on her. But if Grams suspected trouble, that leniency would vanish. Aslan wasn't about to risk that, not if she had a choice. So she needed to keep her panic in check. And she was panicked, more than she had been in years. Enough that she'd actually run for a block, attracting fairy followers. Several gave chase at first, until one of the lupine fairies snarled at the others, and they dropped off, all but one female. She'd lopped alongside Aslan on all fours as they ran up 3rd Avenue. The wolf girl's crystalline fur chimed with an eerily appealing melody, as if it would lull the listener to trust. Aslan slowed, hoping to discourage her, wanting to stop that chiming song. It didn't work. She concentrated on the sound of her feet hitting the pavement, the cars that drove by, a stereo with too much bass, anything but that chiming song. As she rounded the corner onto the Coffer, the red neon sign of the crow's nest reflected on the fairy's fur, emphasizing holly-red eyes. Like the rest of downtown Huntsdale, the building that housed the grungy club showed how far the city had fallen. Facades that were presumably once attractive now bore telltale signs of telltale signs of age and decay. Scrubby weeds sprouted from the cracked sidewalks and half-abandoned lots. Outside of the club, near the deserted railroad yard, the people she passed were likely not looking to score, seeking something, anything, to numb their minds. It wasn't an option she could indulge in, but she didn't begrudge them their chemical refuge. A few girls she recognized waved, but they didn't motion for her to stop. Aslan inclined her head in greeting as she slowed to a normal walking speed. Almost there. One of Seth's friends, Glenn, stepped in her path. As he had so many bars in his face, she'd need to touch them all to count them. Behind her, the wolf girl paced, circling closer until the pungent scent of her fur was chokingly heady. Sorry, chokingly heady. Tell Seth his speakers came in, Glenn started. The wolf girl, still on all fours, nudged Aslan with her head. Aslan stumbled, clutching Glenn's arm for balance. He reached out when she tried to step back. You okay? I guess I just ran too fast. She forced a smile and tried to look like she was winded from her run. Trying to keep warm, you know? Right. The look he gave her was a familiar one, unbelieving. As she started to walk past him to reach the shortcut to Seth's, the door to the crow's nest opened, letting out discordant music. The thump of the drums beat faster than her racing heart. Glenn cleared his throat. Seth's not good with you going through there. He gestured toward the shadowy alley alongside the building. Alone. He'd be upset, you know, if you got messed up. She couldn't tell him the truth. The scary things weren't the guys smoking in the alley, but the lupine fae growling at her feet. It's early. Glenn crossed his arms over his chest and shook his head. Right. Aslan stepped away from the mouth of the alley, away from the shortcut to safety of Seth's steel walls. Glenn watched until she turned back to the street. The wolf girl snapped at the air behind Aslan's ankles until she gave into her fear and took off jogging the rest of the way to the road yard. At the edge of Seth's lot, Aslan stopped to compose herself. Seth was pretty together, but he still freaked out sometimes when she was upset. The wolf girl howled as Aslan walked the last couple yards up to the train, but it didn't bother Aslan as much. Not here. Seth's train was beautiful on so many levels. How could I be upset here? The outside was decorated in murals that ran the gamut from anime to abstract, beautiful to unexpected. They faded into one another like a collage that begged the viewer to make sense of the images, to find an order behind the colorful pastiche. In one of the few warmer months, she'd sat with Seth in this odd garden, studying the art, and realized that the beauty wasn't in order, but in unplanned harmony, like being with Seth. It wasn't just paintings that decorated the garden. Sprouting like unnatural trees along the perimeter was a series of metalwork sculptures Seth had made over the past couple years. Between those sculptures, and in some cases twining around them, were flowering plants and shrubs. Despite the ravages of the lengthy winter months, the plants thrived under Seth's watchful care. Heartbeat calm now, Aslan lifted her hand to knock. Before she could, the door swung open, and Seth stood in the doorway grinning. The streetlights made him look a bit intimidating, illuminating the bars in his eyebrows and the ring in his lower lip. His blue-black hair fell over his face when he moved, like tiny arrows pointing to pronounced cheekbones. Starting to think you were going to bail on me. Didn't know you were expecting me, she said in what she hoped was a casual voice. He gets sexier every day. Not expecting, but hoping, always hoping. He roamed his arms, mostly bare under the sleeves of a black t-shirt. He wasn't bulky, but his arms and the rest of him had obvious definition. He lifted one eyebrow and asked, You gonna come in or just stand there? Anybody else in the house? Just me and Boomer. His tea kettle whistled. He went back inside, calling out as he went, Picked up a sub earlier. Want half? Just tea. Aslan already felt better. Being around him made her feel more confident. Seth was the epitome of calm. When his parents had left on some mission thing and given him everything they owned, he didn't go on a binge. Aside from buying the train cars and converting them into a trailer of sorts, he'd kept it pretty normal. Hung out, partied some. He talked about college, art school, but he wasn't in any rush. She stepped around the piles of books on the floor. Chaucer and Stich sat beside the prose Edda, the Claire Dunkel novel. Seth read everything. We just moved Boomer. He's sluggish tonight. He gestured toward the boa napping on one of the ergonomic chairs in the front of the train, his common room. One green and one bright orange. The chairs curved backward like the letter C. They had no arms, so you could sit with your legs up if you wanted. Beside each of them were plain wood tables with books and papers stacked on them. Carefully, she scooped up the coiled boa, and moved him from the chair to the sofa on the other side of the narrow room. Seth came over with 2 china saucers, a matching cup with blue flowers set on each of them, 2/3 full with tea. High Mountain Oolong just came in this morning. She took one, sloshing a bit over the edge, and tasted. Good. He sat down across from her, holding his cup in one hand, the saucer in the other, and managing to look strangely dignified despite his black nail polish. So, anyone out of the crow's nest? Glenn stopped me. Your speakers came in. Good to know you didn't go inside. They got raided last night. He scowled briefly. Glenn didn't tell you? No, but he knew I wasn't staying. She tucked her feet up, pleased when Seth's scowl faded. So, who'd they get? She sipped her tea and settled in for the latest rumors. Half the time, she could just curl up and listen while he talked to the people who filled his house most nights. Then she could pretend, for a short time at least, that the world was as it seemed to be. No more, no less. Seth gave her that, a private space to believe in the illusion of normalcy. It wasn't why she'd started visiting him when they met a couple years ago. That was purely a result of learning that he lived in a house of steel walls. It was, however, one of the reasons she'd recently started having the wildly stupid thoughts about him. Thoughts of giving in to his flirting, but Seth didn't date. He had a reputation as a great one-night stand, but she wasn't interested in that. Well, she was interested, but not if it meant losing either his friendship or access to his steel-walled heaven. You okay? She'd been staring. Again. Sure, just, I don't know, tired, I guess. You want to talk about it? About what? She sipped the tea and hoped that he'd drop it almost as much as she hoped he wouldn't. How good would it feel to tell someone? Just to talk about it. Grimes didn't talk about the Fae if she could avoid it. She was old, seeming more tired by the day. Too tired to question what Aslan did when she was out. Too tired to ask questions about where she was after dark. Aslan dared another smile, carefully calm, at Seth. I could tell him, but she couldn't. Not really. It was one of the rules Grimes insisted they never break. Would he believe me? Somewhere in the depths of the second train car, music played. Another of his mixes with everything from Godsmack to the Dresden Dolls, Sugarcult to Rachmaninoff. The other stuff she couldn't actually identify. It was peaceful, until Seth stopped mid-story and set his tea on the table beside him. Please, tell me what's going on. Her hand shook, spilling tea on the floor. He didn't usually push her. It wasn't his way. What do you mean? There's nothing. Oh, come on, Ash. You look worried lately. You're here a lot more often, and unless it's something about us, he stared at her with an unreadable expression. Is it? Avoiding eye contact, she said, We're fine. She went to the kitchen and grabbed a rag to mop up the tea. What then? Are you in some sort of trouble? He reached for her as she walked past. I'm fine. She dodged his outstretched hand and went to sop up the tea, staring at the floor, trying to ignore the fact that he was watching her. So, where is everyone? I told everyone I needed a few days. Wanted a chance to see you alone. Talk and stuff. With a sigh, he reached down and pulled the rag away from her. He tossed it towards the kitchen, where it landed on the table with a splat. Talk to me. She stood up, but he caught her hand before she could walk away again. He pulled her closer. I'm here. I'll be here, whatever it is. It's nothing, really. She stood there, one hand in his, the other hanging uselessly at her side. I just need to be somewhere safe with good company. Did someone hurt you? He sounded weirder then, tense. No, she bit her lips. She hadn't thought he would ask so many questions. She counted on it, in fact. Someone want to? He pulled her down into his lap, tucking her head under his chin, holding her securely. She didn't resist. He'd held her every year when she came back from visiting her mom's grave. He had held her when Grimes had gotten sick last year. His holding her wasn't strange. The questions were. I don't know. She felt stupid for it, but she'd started crying. A big, dumb tear she couldn't stop. I don't know what they want. Seth stroked her hair, running his hand down the length of it and onto her back. But do you know who they are? Sort of, she nodded, sniffling. Bet that's attractive. She tried to pull away. So, that's a good place to start. He wrapped one arm tighter around her and leaned over to pick a notebook and pen off the floor. Propping the notebook on her knee, he held the pen poised over it. With a reassuring smile, he prompted, Tell me, we'll figure it out. Talk to some people. Check out the police blotter. Police blotter? Sure, find out more about them. He gave her a reassuring look. Ask Robert down at the tat shop. He hears everything. We find out who they are, then we'll take care of it. They're not going to be anything in the blotter. Not on these two. Aslan smiled at the ideas of fairies' crimes being reported on the blotter. They'd need a whole section of the daily paper just for fairy crimes, especially in the safe neighborhoods. The upscale homes were in greener areas outside the safety of steel frames and bridges. So we use other routes. He pushed her hair away from her face, wiping a tear off her cheek in the process. Seriously, I'm a research god. Give me a clue. I'll find something we can use. Blackmail, deal, whatever. Maybe they're wanted for something. If not, maybe they're breaking a law, harassment or something. That's a crime, right? If not, there's people Rabbit knows. Aslan disentangled herself from his arms and went over to the sofa. Boomer barely stirred when she sat down next to him. Too cold, she shivered. It's always too cold. She stroked his skin while she thought, Seth hasn't ever told anyone about Mom or anything. He can be careful. Seth sat back and crossed his ankles, waiting. She stared at the worn vintage tee he had on. Damp from her tears now, the peeling white letters proclaimed, Pixies. Maybe it's a sign. She'd thought about it so often, imagined telling him. He looked expectantly at her. She wiped her cheeks again. Okay. When she didn't say anything else, he crooked one glittering eyebrow and prompted her again. Ash? Right. She swallowed and said as calmly as she could. Fairies. Fairies are stalking me. Fairies? Fairies. She pulled her legs up to sit cross-legged on the sofa. Boomer lifted his head to look at her, his tongue flicking out and slid further into her lap. Seth picked up his tea and took a drink. She'd never told anyone before. It was one of Graham's unbreakable rules. Never know who's listening. Never know when they're hiding nearby. Aslan's heart thudded. She could feel herself getting nauseous. What did I do? But she wanted him to know, wanted to talk to someone. Aslan took several calming breaths and added, 2 of them. They've been following me for a couple weeks. Carefully, as if he were moving in slow motion, Seth leaned forward, sitting on the edge of his chair, almost close enough to touch. You messing with me? No, she bit her lip and waited. Boomer slithered closer, dragging the front of his body up over her chest. Absently, she stroked his head. Seth poked at the ring in his lip, a stalling gesture. The way some people lick their lips in tense conversation. Like little winged people? No, like our size and terrifying. She tried to smile, but it didn't work. Her chest hurt, like someone had kicked her. She was breaking rules that she lived by, her mother had lived by, her Grams, everyone in her family for so long. How do you know they're fairies? Never mind, she looked away. I just forget. Don't do that to me. His voice had a bite of frustration in it. Talk to me. And say what? He stared at her and answered, Say you'll trust me. Say you'll let me in for real, finally. She didn't answer. She didn't know what to say. Sure, she'd kept things from him, but she'd kept things from everyone. That's just the way it was. He sighed. Then he put his glasses and held the pen poised over the notebook. Right. Tell me what you know. What do they look like? You won't be able to see them. He paused again. Why? She didn't look away this time. They're invisible. Seth didn't answer. The moment they just sat there, quietly staring at each other. Her hands stilled on Boomer as she waited, but the boa didn't move away. Finally, Seth started writing. Then he looked up. What else? Why? Why are you doing this? Seth shrugged, but his voice wasn't nonchalant when he answered. Because I want you to trust me? Because I want you to stop looking so haunted? Because I care about you? Say you go do your research. What if they, hurt you, attack you? She knew how awful they could be, even if he couldn't get it. For going to the library, he crooked his eyebrow again. She was still trying to get her head together, to find a line between begging him to really believe her and telling him she wasn't serious. She pushed Boomer off onto the sofa cushion and stood up. You see them hurt anyone? Yes, she started, but she stopped herself. She paced over to the window. 3 fairies lingered outside, not doing anything, but undeniably there. 2 of them were almost human-looking, but the third was far from as human as they got. Too big and covered in dark tufts of fur, like a bear that walked upright. She looked away and shuddered. Not these 2, but I don't know. Fairies grope people, trip them, pinch them, stupid stuff usually. Sometimes it's worse though, a lot worse. You don't want to get involved. I do want to. Trust me, Ash, please? Half smiling then, he added, and I don't mind being groped. Perks for helping. You should. Fairies are... She shook her head again. He was joking about it. You can't see what they look like. Without meaning to, she pictured Keenan. Blushing, she stammered. Most of them are pretty horrible. Not all of them, though? Seth asked quietly, not smiling anymore. Most of them. She looked back at the 3 fairies outside, unwilling to look at Seth when she admitted it. But no, not all of them. And that's the end of chapter 2. And that's where I'm going to finish for today. So, hope you enjoyed it. Bye.